My ex cheated on me while he was away in the army, then married the girl he cheated with and moved her to my hometown like I never existed. For years, I stayed silent. I tried to move on, tried to forget everything he put me through. But one day, his wife's Instagram appeared in my feed, and I saw her posting about how perfect he was, how lucky she was to have him, how he treated her like a queen. And sitting there staring at that post, I realized something. She had no idea who she actually married. So I opened my phone, typed out one message, and told her the truth about everything. If you've ever trusted someone with your whole heart only to find out they were lying the entire time, then you already understand how painful betrayal can be. But sometimes the truth has a way of catching up with people when they least expect it. So if you enjoy revenge stories where karma finally shows up at the perfect moment, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Because this story starts with love and loyalty, but it ends with a message that completely shattered the perfect image my ex tried to build. Now let me take you back to the beginning, back to the time when I still believed the future we talked about together was real. We were together for 3 years, and during those 3 years, my entire life slowly started revolving around him. When you spend that much time with someone, they become part of your routine without you even realizing it. You wake up expecting to see their good morning text. You automatically think of them when something funny happens during the day. When you make plans for the future, they're included in every version of that future without question. That was what our relationship felt like in the beginning. Comfortable, stable, familiar. We met when we were both still figuring out our lives, still trying to decide what direction we wanted to go. He had this confident personality that made people naturally like him. He was funny in a sarcastic kind of way, the type of person who could turn almost any situation into a joke. When we first started dating, being around him felt easy. There was never that awkward stage where you don't know what to say to each other. Conversations just flowed naturally. Most nights we would end up talking for hours about absolutely nothing important. Sometimes we'd sit in his car outside my house long after midnight just listening to music and talking about random things. Other times we'd grab food late at night and drive around with no real destination. Those kinds of moments might sound small, but they were the ones that made our relationship feel real. The longer we stayed together, the more our lives started intertwining. I got to know his family. He got to know mine. Holidays slowly started blending together, birthdays became shared events, and our friends began seeing us as a pair instead of two separate people. And like most couples who stay together for years, we talked about the future constantly. Where we might live someday, what kind of house we would want, what careers we hope to build. Sometimes we would joke about what our kids might look like one day, laughing about which one of us had the worst genetics to pass down. At the time, those conversations didn't feel like fantasies. They felt like plans. That's why, when he came to me one evening and told me he was thinking about joining the Army Reserves, I didn't react with fear or hesitation. My first reaction was pride. He explained everything carefully, like he had spent days thinking about how to bring it up. He told me joining the reserves would help him pay for college. He talked about the benefits, the discipline, the opportunities it could open for him in the future. He said it would only require certain periods of training and service, and that, in the long run, it could help us build a better life. I remember listening to him and thinking that it actually sounded like a smart decision. He wasn't talking about leaving permanently or disappearing forever. He was talking about investing in his future. Our future. Of course, there was one obvious challenge: boot camp. Boot camp meant months apart. It meant limited communication, strict schedules, and long stretches of time where we wouldn't be able to talk like we normally did. But relationships survive things like that all the time. Military couples deal with it constantly. So I told him I supported his decision. Looking back now, that moment feels strange. Because if someone had shown me how everything would eventually turn out, I don't know if I would have been able to say those words so confidently. But at the time, I loved him. And when you love someone, you naturally want to support their dreams. The night before he left for boot camp is still one of the clearest memories I have from that time. We were sitting in his car outside my house long after we had said goodbye to everyone else. The street was quiet, and the radio was playing softly in the background. Neither of us wanted to say the final goodbye because we both knew that once he drove away, things would start changing. He looked at me and said, "It's only a few months. We'll be fine." I remember nodding and smiling, even though part of me already felt nervous about the distance. Before he left, he pulled me into a tight hug and told me he loved me. I held on to him for a moment longer than usual, like my brain was trying to memorize the feeling of that moment. Then he started the car and drove away. At the time, I believed we were strong enough to get through anything. I had no idea that this would be the beginning of the slow collapse of our entire relationship. Waiting for someone during boot camp is a strange experience. Your life starts revolving around moments you can't control. Letters become incredibly important. A short phone call can instantly turn a bad day into the best day of the week. Every time my phone rang, my heart would jump because there was always the chance it might be him. Sometimes it was just a random notification or a friend texting, but every now and then it actually was him calling. Those calls were usually short. Boot camp schedules are strict, and recruits don't get unlimited free time to chat with their girlfriends back home. But hearing his voice even for a few minutes made everything feel worth it. He would tell me about how exhausting training was. The early mornings, the physical drills, the constant pressure from instructors. Sometimes he sounded so tired that I could barely recognize his voice. I tried to be supportive in every way I could. I wrote letters encouraging him. I reminded him how proud I was of him. Whenever we spoke, I tried to keep the conversation positive so he wouldn't feel more stressed than he already was. Months passed like that, slowly, patiently, and eventually graduation day arrived. Standing there watching him in uniform filled me with an overwhelming sense of pride. Seeing someone you love accomplish something difficult has a way of making you feel like you were part of that journey too. I thought we had survived the hardest part, but the truth was, the real problems hadn't even started yet, because after boot camp ended, he was sent to training school in another state, and that's when everything began to change. The moment he left for training school in another state was the moment everything slowly began to unravel, although at the time I didn't fully realize it yet. Boot camp had been hard, but it was also structured and controlled. His schedule was strict, communication was limited, and in a strange way that actually made our relationship feel stable because I always knew exactly why he couldn't talk or text much. Training school was different. Suddenly, he had more freedom again. He wasn't under constant supervision, and he had access to his phone more often. At least, that's what I assumed. In reality, what he gained wasn't just freedom from military structure. He gained freedom from accountability, and that freedom was the beginning of everything that went wrong between us. At first, the changes were subtle enough that I convinced myself they didn't mean anything. His texts started getting shorter. Instead of the long conversations we used to have every night, I started receiving quick responses that felt rushed and distracted. Sometimes hours would pass before he replied, which was unusual for him because before he left, we were constantly messaging each other throughout the day. When I asked how training school was going, his answers were vague. He'd say things like, "It's good," or "just busy," and then quickly change the subject. It wasn't like him to be so distant, but every time I started feeling worried, I reminded myself that he was adjusting to a new environment. He was in a different state, surrounded by new people, learning new responsibilities. Of course, things would feel different for a while. But the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the strange feeling in my stomach whenever we talked. It wasn't just that he seemed busy. It was the way he sounded emotionally disconnected, like the conversations we used to enjoy were suddenly a chore for him. There were moments during our calls when he would go quiet for a few seconds, like his attention had drifted somewhere else. Sometimes he'd laugh at something happening in the background and then quickly try to focus back on the conversation with me. Those moments were small, but they planted seeds of doubt in my mind. I remember one specific phone call that stands out when I think back to that time. I had just gotten home from work and decided to call him because we hadn't spoken in 2 days. When he answered, he sounded slightly out of breath, like he had been moving around quickly before picking up the phone. I asked what he was doing, and he casually said he had just come back from hanging out with some people from his unit. That didn't bother me at first. Of course he was going to make friends while he was there. That was completely normal. But as the conversation continued, I noticed something strange. Every time I asked about who he was with, he gave vague answers. He said things like, just some people from training, or a couple friends, but he never mentioned anyone by name. At the time, I didn't push the issue because I didn't want to sound paranoid or controlling. I trusted him, and I believed that trust meant giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Over the next few weeks, that strange pattern continued. Communication slowly became more inconsistent. Sometimes he would text me normally for a day or two, and I'd start thinking everything was fine again. Then suddenly, he would disappear for almost an entire day without responding. When he finally did reply, he always had an explanation ready. Training had been long. His phone had died. He had fallen asleep early. The excuses always sounded believable enough that I couldn't quite accuse him of anything directly. But deep down, something felt off, like a quiet alarm ringing somewhere in the back of my mind. One night, a mutual friend messaged me out of nowhere. The message itself was simple, but it carried a weight that made my stomach drop the second I read it. She asked me, "Hey, are you and him still together?" That question immediately made my chest tighten. I responded that yes, of course we were still together. And then I asked why she was asking. There was a long pause before she replied, and I remember staring at the typing bubble on my screen while 1,000 different possibilities raced through my mind. When her message finally appeared, it felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. She told me she had heard that he had been spending a lot of time with a girl from his training unit. At first I tried to laugh it off. People gossip all the time, and rumors can start easily when someone is away from home. I told myself there was probably nothing to worry about, but that message planted a seed of anxiety that I couldn't ignore anymore. Suddenly, every delayed response, every short text, every distracted phone call started looking different in my mind. Instead of innocent explanations, they began to feel like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving. A few days later, I decided to bring it up casually during one of our phone calls. I didn't accuse him of anything directly because I didn't want to start a fight over a rumor. I simply asked if he had made any new friends in his unit. For a split second, there was a pause on the other end of the phone. It was a very small pause, maybe only a second or two, but it was noticeable enough that I remember it clearly even now. Then he laughed lightly and said something like, "Yeah, of course. Everyone here hangs out together." His tone sounded relaxed, almost amused that I would even ask the question. So I pushed a little further and asked if there were any girls in the group he spent time with. That's when his tone shifted slightly. He didn't get angry, but his response felt defensive. He told me I was overthinking things and that training school wasn't like college where people were constantly partying and dating. He said everyone was focused on their work and that the rumors I was hearing were probably just nonsense. At that moment, I had a choice. I could trust him or I could start digging deeper. And because I loved him and believed in the relationship we had built over 3 years, I chose to trust him. Looking back now, that decision almost feels painful to remember. Because while I was trying to protect our relationship by trusting him, he was already destroying it behind my back. Months passed like that, with this strange mix of normal moments and subtle tension. Some days everything felt fine again. He would call me and tell me about something funny that happened during training, and for a little while it felt like the old version of him was still there. But then the distance would creep back in. The conversations would shorten. The emotional warmth that used to define our relationship slowly faded into something colder and more distant. The truth finally began revealing itself through small pieces of information that reached me from different directions. Someone mentioned seeing pictures of him hanging out with people from his unit. Another person casually brought up the same girl my friend had mentioned earlier. None of these pieces of information were enough to prove anything by themselves, but together they painted a picture that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. Eventually, the realization hit me with a clarity that made my chest feel heavy. He wasn't just distracted or busy, he was cheating on me. And the worst part was that while I was sitting at home being loyal and supportive, believing in the relationship we had built together, he was building an entirely new relationship with someone else. At that point, I still didn't know how deep the betrayal actually went. I didn't know that the girl he was seeing already knew about me. I didn't know that he was telling different stories to both of us. And I definitely didn't know that the situation was about to get even more humiliating than I could have imagined. Because eventually, he would come back home. But not for me. And when he did, everything would finally explode. By the time I fully realized he was cheating on me, the relationship we once had already felt like it was hanging by a thread. But even then, part of me still hoped I was wrong. When you've spent years loving someone, your mind will do almost anything to avoid accepting the worst possible explanation. You start making excuses for them in your own head. Maybe the rumors were exaggerated. Maybe he was just spending time with someone as a friend. Maybe the distance and stress of training had just made communication harder. I clung to those possibilities. Because the alternative, that the man I had trusted for 3 years was lying to me every day, felt too painful to accept all at once. For a while, he continued acting like nothing had changed. He would still call occasionally, still talk about coming home after training ended, still make small comments about things we would do together when he returned. Looking back now, that period was probably the most confusing part of the entire experience. Because while he was building a relationship with another woman behind my back, he was still keeping me emotionally tied to him. It was like he had created 2 completely separate realities and was somehow managing both at the same time. The strange part was that there were moments when he almost seemed guilty. Sometimes during our conversations, he would go quiet in the middle of a sentence, like he had suddenly remembered something he shouldn't have said. Other times he would overcompensate by acting overly affectionate, telling me he missed me, telling me he couldn't wait to see me again. Those moments would temporarily calm the anxiety building inside me. I wanted to believe those words were genuine, but eventually the truth started slipping through the cracks in ways he couldn't control. One evening, another mutual acquaintance mentioned casually that they had seen pictures of him online hanging out with people from his training unit. I asked where the pictures were posted, and they told me they had seen them on someone else's social media account. When I tried to find them myself, I realized something strange. He had stopped posting anything publicly. In fact, he had become extremely quiet on social media altogether. At the time, that seemed like a small detail, but later I realized it probably wasn't an accident. It was easier for him to hide what he was doing if he controlled what people could see. Eventually, I managed to find one of those photos through someone else's profile. It was just a group picture of several people standing together after some kind of training event. At first glance, nothing looked suspicious. Everyone was smiling, wearing casual clothes instead of uniforms, standing close together like friends who had just finished a long day. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach twist slightly. There was a girl standing next to him, closer than anyone else in the group. Their shoulders were touching, and the way they leaned slightly toward each other looked comfortable, familiar. It wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it was enough to make that quiet voice in my head start screaming louder. When I asked him about it later, his reaction immediately put me on edge. Instead of calmly explaining who she was, he got defensive almost instantly. He told me I was reading too much into a random picture and that she was just someone from his training group. He even laughed slightly, like the idea of anything romantic between them was ridiculous. Then he flipped the conversation around and asked why I was suddenly acting insecure. That tactic worked on me at the time. I hated the idea of being the jealous girlfriend who accused her boyfriend of cheating based on rumors and a single photo. So I apologized for bringing it up and told him I trusted him. Even as I said those words, part of me felt uneasy. But I pushed that feeling down because I didn't want to create problems where there might not be any. Unfortunately, the reality was that the problem already existed. I just hadn't seen the full picture yet. As the months passed, his visits home became the next strange chapter in our relationship. There was a short period when he came back to our hometown for a break before his training was completely finished. I remember feeling excited when he told me he would be home for a while. After months of long-distance communication, I thought, seeing each other in person would bring back the closeness we used to have. By the time I fully realized he was cheating on me, the relationship we once had already felt like it was hanging by a thread. But even then, part of me still hoped I was wrong. When you've spent years loving someone, your mind will do almost anything to avoid accepting the worst possible explanation. You start making excuses for them in your own head. Maybe the rumors were exaggerated. Maybe he was just spending time with someone as a friend. Maybe the distance and stress of training had just made communication harder. I clung to those possibilities because the alternative, that the man I had trusted for 3 years was lying to me every day, felt too painful to accept all at once. For a while, he continued acting like nothing had changed. He would still call, occasionally still talk about coming home after training ended, still make small comments about things we would do together when he returned. Looking back now, that period was probably the most confusing part of the entire experience. Because, while he was building a relationship with another woman behind my back, he was still keeping me emotionally tied to him. It was like he had created 2 completely separate realities and was somehow managing both at the same time. The strange part was that there were moments when he almost seemed guilty. Sometimes during our conversations, he would go quiet in the middle of a sentence, like he had suddenly remembered something he shouldn't have said. Other times he would overcompensate by acting overly affectionate, telling me he missed me, telling me he couldn't wait to see me again. Those moments would temporarily calm the anxiety building inside me. I wanted to believe those words were genuine. But eventually the truth started slipping through the cracks in ways he couldn't control. One evening, another mutual acquaintance mentioned casually that they had seen pictures of him online hanging out with people from his training unit. I asked where the pictures were posted, and they told me they had seen them on someone else's social media account. When I tried to find them myself, I realized something strange. He had stopped posting anything publicly. In fact, he had become extremely quiet on social media altogether. At the time, that seemed like a small detail. But later I realized it probably wasn't an accident. It was easier for him to hide what he was doing if he controlled what people could see. Eventually, I managed to find one of those photos through someone else's profile. It was just a group picture of several people standing together after some kind of training event. At first glance, nothing looked suspicious. Everyone was smiling, wearing casual clothes instead of uniforms, standing close together like friends who had just finished a long day. But as I looked closer, I noticed something that made my stomach twist slightly. There was a girl standing next to him, closer than anyone else in the group. Their shoulders were touching, and the way they leaned slightly toward each other looked comfortable, familiar. It wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it was enough to make that quiet voice in my head start screaming louder. When I asked him about it later, his reaction immediately put me on edge. Instead of calmly explaining who she was, he got defensive almost instantly. He told me I was reading too much into a random picture and that she was just someone from his training group. He even laughed slightly, like the idea of anything romantic between them was ridiculous. Then he flipped the conversation around and asked why I was suddenly acting insecure. That tactic worked on me at the time. I hated the idea of being the jealous girlfriend who accused her boyfriend of cheating based on rumors and a single photo. So I apologized for bringing it up and told him I trusted him. Even as I said those words, part of me felt uneasy. But I pushed that feeling down because I didn't want to create problems where there might not be any. Unfortunately, the reality was that the problem already existed. I just hadn't seen the full picture yet. As the months passed, his visits home became the next strange chapter in our relationship. There was a short period when he came back to our hometown for a break before his training was completely finished. I remember feeling excited when he told me he would be home for a while. After months of long-distance communication, I thought, seeing each other in person would bring back the closeness we used to have. But when we finally saw each other again, something felt different almost immediately. At first glance, everything seemed normal. He hugged me when we met, smiled the same way he always had, asked about how things had been going for me while he was away. But there was a subtle emotional distance that I couldn't quite explain. It was like talking to someone who looked exactly like the person you knew but didn't feel the same anymore. During that time, he spent several weeks in town, and those weeks revealed things about him that made the situation even more confusing. For Pi, one thing, he didn't seem particularly interested in spending as much time together as I expected. After being apart for so long, I thought we would want to see each other constantly. Instead, he often made vague plans with other people. Sometimes he said he was meeting old friends. Sometimes he said he had errands to run or family obligations. I tried not to question it too much because I didn't want to seem controlling, but the pattern was noticeable. Later, I learned something that made that period feel even more humiliating in hindsight. During the short time he was home, while I still believed we were trying to fix our relationship, he had been flirting with other women. In fact, I later found out there were at least 2 separate women he had kissed during that time. When I first heard that information months later, I remember sitting there feeling completely stunned. It wasn't just that he had cheated while he was away. It was that even when he came back home, even when he was standing in front of me pretending everything was fine, he still couldn't stop himself from chasing attention from other women. But at the time, I didn't know any of that. Yet, at the time I was still trying to understand why the connection between us felt like it was slowly disappearing. Then one day, everything finally became clear. Found out that the girl from his training unit wasn't just someone he was casually spending time with. She was his girlfriend, and she had known about me the entire time. Learning that detail felt like someone had dumped ice water over my head. Up until that moment, I had been imagining the situation as some kind of secret affair he was hiding from both of us. But realizing that she knew about me, and still chose to be involved with him anyway, added an entirely new layer of humiliation to the situation. It meant that somewhere out there was a woman who knew I existed and still continued building a relationship with the man I loved, and even worse. He had apparently convinced her that everything he was doing was somehow justified. By the time the truth fully surfaced, it was already too late to fix anything, because the next thing I heard about him completely blindsided me. He had come back. Home. But he didn't come back to rebuild our relationship. He came back married. The day I found out he was married is a moment that still feels surreal when I think back on it. It didn't happen in some dramatic confrontation or emotional conversation. There was no warning, no explanation, no moment where he sat me down and told me the truth like an adult. Instead, I heard about it the same way people hear gossip in small towns, through someone else. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it casually, during a conversation, almost like it was normal news everyone already knew. I remember the exact feeling that rushed through my body when I heard the words. At first, my brain simply refused to process them. Married. That word didn't even make sense in the context of the relationship I thought we still had. For a few seconds, I just stared at the person talking, waiting for them to correct themselves, waiting for them to say they had misunderstood something, but they didn't. They continued explaining that he had married the girl from his training unit at a courthouse not long after returning from out of state. The entire thing had apparently happened quickly, quietly, and without any real announcement. Hearing that felt like the ground had suddenly disappeared under my feet. 3 years of my life had just been erased in a single sentence. The worst part wasn't just the marriage itself. It was everything surrounding it. The timeline made it painfully clear that while I was still believing we were trying to fix our relationship, he had already moved forward with someone else. While I was still answering his calls and trying to understand the emotional distance between us, he had apparently been planning a completely different future with another woman. It made every conversation we had during those months feel fake, in hindsight, like I had been unknowingly participating in a performance where I was the only person who didn't know the script. For a while after I heard the news, I felt completely numb. There was anger somewhere deep inside me, but it was buried under layers of shock and humiliation. I kept replaying the past year in my head, looking for the exact moment when everything had truly fallen apart. Had he already been seeing her? When he was still telling me he loved me? Had all those phone calls been lies from the very beginning? The more I thought about it, the worse it felt. Every memory from that period suddenly looked different, like I was watching the same story, but finally seeing all the details I had missed before. Eventually, I learned something else that made the situation even harder to process. Not only had he married her quickly, he had also brought her to my hometown. She wasn't originally from here. She had lived in another state before meeting him during training. But after their courthouse wedding, he moved her here like it was the most normal thing in the world. That detail hit me in a way I didn't expect. It meant that the woman he cheated on me with was now living in the same place where everyone knew about our 3-year relationship. She was walking through the same streets, going to the same stores, existing in the same social circles where people remembered us as a couple. For a long time after that, I avoided places where I thought I might run into them. The thought of seeing them together made my chest tighten in a way that was difficult to explain. It wasn't just jealousy or heartbreak, it was the humiliation of knowing that he had replaced me so easily and so publicly. In a small town, people talk. News spreads quickly, and even if no one said anything directly to my face, I knew people were aware of what had happened. During that period, I tried my best to focus on rebuilding my own life. I spent more time with friends. I threw myself into work. I tried to create a new routine that didn't revolve around someone who had already proven he didn't deserve that space in my life. Healing from something like that isn't a quick process. Some days I felt strong and independent, like I had completely moved on. Other days, something small, a song we used to listen to, a place we used to visit together, would suddenly bring the memories flooding back. But over time, the emotional intensity slowly faded. The anger softened into something quieter. The heartbreak eventually turned into indifference. At least, that's what I thought had happened. Years passed like that. I didn't speak to him. I didn't try to confront him about anything. I didn't reach out to the girl he had married, even though part of me knew she had been aware of my existence the entire time. I simply moved forward with my life and left that entire chapter behind me. Or at least I believed I had. Then one random day, completely out of nowhere, her Instagram account appeared in my suggested profiles. It was such a small, insignificant moment at first. Just another suggestion from the algorithm while I was scrolling through my phone. But the second I saw her name and profile picture, something inside me froze. I hadn't thought about her in a long time, but suddenly the entire past rushed back into my mind all at once. Curiosity got the better of me. I tapped on the profile. Her account was public, which meant I could see everything without restriction. The first thing that caught my attention was how happy everything looked. Every picture seemed carefully chosen to show the perfect version of their life together. There were photos of them smiling at restaurants, pictures of small vacations, pictures of them standing together at family gatherings. In almost every photo, he had his arm around her shoulders like they were the happiest couple in the world. For a moment, I felt that old sting of anger return, the same feeling of unfairness I had experienced years earlier. It's strange how quickly old emotions can resurface when you're confronted with something connected to the past. But then I kept scrolling, and that's when I saw the post that changed everything. She had uploaded a picture of him standing next to her outside, what looked like their house. Both of them were smiling, and the caption underneath the photo was long. It was one of those captions where someone writes a small paragraph about how grateful they are for their partner. She talked about how lucky she felt to have such a caring husband. She mentioned how he always opened the car door for her, how he supported her through difficult moments, how he treated her with kindness every day. Reading those words felt surreal, because the man she was describing sounded nothing like the person I had known. The person I had known was capable of lying for months, cheating behind my back, and leading multiple women on at the same time. The person I had known had broken my trust so completely that it took years for me to rebuild my confidence in relationships again. Yet here she was, proudly announcing to the world how wonderful he was. I sat there staring at that post for a long time. At first, I wasn't even sure what emotion I was feeling. It wasn't exactly anger. It wasn't sadness either. It was something more complicated than that. It was the realization that she probably had no idea who she had actually married. And that realization slowly led to a thought I hadn't seriously considered before. Maybe she deserved to know the truth. That thought stayed in my mind long after I closed Instagram that day. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it wasn't my problem anymore. Years had passed since everything happened, and I had worked hard to move forward with my life. Reopening old wounds didn't seem like a healthy decision. But the more I thought about that caption she had written, the harder it became to let the idea go. She was talking about him like he was some kind of perfect husband, someone who treated her with honesty and loyalty. And maybe part of me felt frustrated knowing that the version of him she believed in simply wasn't real. I knew what he was capable of. I had experienced it firsthand. For a while, I kept going back and forth in my mind about whether I should say anything. One part of me wanted to leave everything alone. After all, maybe their relationship had actually changed him. Maybe he had grown up and become a better person. Maybe interfering would only create unnecessary drama that no longer had anything to do with me. But another part of me couldn't stop thinking about the fact that she had known about me during the time they started their relationship. That detail always stuck with me. She wasn't completely innocent in the situation. She had been aware that he had a girlfriend back home and still chose to pursue something with him anyway. Back then, I had stayed silent because I didn't want to get involved in their relationship drama. But now, seeing the way she publicly praised him like he was some flawless partner, it felt strange knowing how different the truth actually was. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me again, and I opened her profile one more time. I started scrolling through her posts slowly, paying attention to the little details I hadn't noticed before. The more I looked, the clearer it became that she had built a very specific image of him online. Every caption talked about his kindness, his loyalty, his good character. In one post, she even joked about how he was such a gentleman because he always opened the car door for her. That particular line made me laugh out loud in a way that surprised even me. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from realizing how absurd something really is. Because opening a car door doesn't erase the fact that someone lied and cheated their way into a relationship. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't heartbroken anymore. I wasn't even trying to get revenge in the traditional sense. What I felt instead was a strange sense of clarity. The truth had always been sitting there, and the only person who didn't know it was her. So I opened the message button. At first, the screen just sat there blank while I stared at the empty text box. I remember thinking about how strange the situation was. Years earlier, I had been devastated by this man's actions. Now I was sitting calmly on my couch, about to type a message that could completely change the way his wife saw him. I started writing slowly. I introduced myself first, because I knew she would probably recognize my name immediately. After that, I kept the message straightforward. I didn't insult her. I didn't attack him emotionally. I simply explained the timeline of what had happened when he was away at training. I told her about the 3-year relationship we had before. He left. I explained how he had stayed in contact with me for months while secretly building a relationship with her at the same time. I mentioned the other women he had kissed during the short period when he came back home before she moved to our town. And finally, I told her some of the things he had said about her behind her back then, including the comments about her bad credit and the fixer-upper house they had apparently bought together. The entire message wasn't very long, but it contained everything I felt she deserved to know. When I finished typing, I read through it one more time to make sure it didn't sound overly emotional or dramatic. I wanted the message to come across as calm and factual. The truth was already powerful enough on its own. Then I pressed send. Farai. A few seconds I just stared at the screen, almost expecting something immediate to happen. Of course nothing did. The message simply showed the word sent, and that was it. But what happened later that same day told me everything I needed to know. Not long after I sent the message, I noticed that my ex's social media accounts had suddenly disappeared. His Instagram was gone. His Facebook page had been deactivated. Even some of the older profiles I knew about were no longer accessible. The suddenness of it was almost funny. It felt like someone had flipped a switch and erased his entire online presence within a matter of hours. Then I went back to her profile. The post I had seen earlier that day, the one where she talked about how amazing he was and how lucky she felt to have him, had been deleted. Just like that. No explanation, no replacement post, just gone. When I saw that, I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath that I didn't even realize I had been holding. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or bitterness. What I felt was something closer to relief. For years, the truth had been sitting silently in the background of my life, and now it had finally reached the person who needed to hear it. I never received a reply from her, and honestly, I didn't expect one. Whatever conversation happened between them after that message was something they had to deal with themselves. But judging from how quickly his social media disappeared and how fast that post was deleted, I have a feeling that night probably wasn't very comfortable for him. And I won't lie. The idea that he might have ended up sleeping on the couch that night crossed my mind more than once. Looking back now, some people might say what I did was petty. Maybe it was. But after everything he put me through, after the lies and the humiliation and the months of emotional manipulation, telling the truth felt incredibly satisfying. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying someone's life. Sometimes, it's simply about making sure the truth finally gets heard, and that message was the truth. What I learned from that entire experience is that people can hide their true character for a long time, but eventually the truth has a way of catching up with them. Lies can build relationships, but they rarely build stable ones. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do after being betrayed is simply walk away, rebuild your life, and let the truth speak for itself when the time is right. If this story kept you hooked until the end, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more intense revenge stories just like this one. And I'm curious what you think. Do you believe she deserved to know the truth, or should? I have stayed silent after all those years. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.